If you haven't been with us for the last couple of weeks, we have been in a series that I titled Lessons from Moms Who Made a Difference. In the first week, we talked about Rahab and some of the lessons that we could learn from her, like acknowledging the obvious truths before you, when you need help, appeal to those who can make a difference, and following through with the conditions of your commitments. Last week, we talked about Ruth. We talked about a life well lived. And a life well lived is one with determination and commitment. It is one that causes others to take notice. And it is a life that can encourage others to do the right thing. Well, today we're going to continue in that series, and we're going to use the example of a mother by the name of Hannah. Now, let me give you just a little bit of background information. Hannah's account is found in 1 Samuel chapter 1. So if you have your scriptures with you today, go ahead and turn there. But as 1 Samuel chapter 1 opens, we see a man by the name of Elkanah who has two wives. One wife's name is Peninnah, and the other is Hannah. And as we read in the early verses of 1 Samuel there, Elkanah would go up each year to worship at Shiloh, and while they were there, he would give offerings. But the early verses of 1 Samuel 1 also tell us something about his two wives. One wife, Peninnah, she had multiple children, but Hannah had none. And starting in verse 5, let me read you what it says there in 1 Samuel chapter 1. It says, "But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved her even though the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival would provoke her and taunt her viciously. And this went on year after year. And whenever Hannah went up from the house of the Lord, her rival taunted her until she wept and would not eat." Today, the lessons that I want us to learn from Hannah, who is going to be a mom, just is not yet, but I want us to learn lessons about how to deal with difficult situations and how to deal with difficult circumstances. You see, Hannah faced the scrutiny of everyone around her in her day due to the fact that she did not have any children. And our culture doesn't place the same emphasis on this as their culture did, because their culture associated it with several different things of a very grave nature. And commentators and scholars are very consistent on this. Let me read you just some excerpts how Nelson's Illustrated Manners and Customs of the Bible would describe this. They say in there, the editors do, that townspeople ridiculed a barren woman by calling her a reproach. And even those who loved her treated her as an object of pity and placed her in the same category as a widow. They go on to say, but barrenness was more than a physical or social problem. Deep religious meanings were attached to the problem as well, and so barrenness was thought to be a result of disobeying God. And then at the end of that section, they say this: "It is hard for us to imagine how devastating these events would have been for the childless wife. She was spiritually ruined, socially disgraced, and psychologically depressed." And so today, when we think about Hannah, and I chose Hannah in this list for this specific reason, we think about a mom-to-be who had to understand how to deal with difficult times. Now today, I'm going to be honest, I don't know what you're facing. I don't. Looking out over a congregation this size gathered here today, I don't know the specifics of your life, but I do know, statistically speaking, that it could be some of these things. Today, you may be here and you may be dealing with a health issue that you really don't know what is coming next. You may be here today and you're dealing with a financial issue, and you know, it's one of those situations where you're looking at the checking account and you're looking at the stack of bills and you're saying, I don't know what's going to happen. You may be here today having family issues and family problems that you're saying, I wish we could just fix it, but I don't know how. I don't know the specifics of those in your lives today. But I do know this. If you're facing an issue today that when you look at it, you say, man, it is this mountain in front of me that I don't know how I'm going to climb it. It's this wall that I see no way around. Hannah today can be an example for you and for me of how to face it, of what to do in difficult situations. And so let's go with our first lesson that we see from this to be mom, and that is that we raise our concerns to the Lord. You know, we're really good sometimes at being really passive. We're really good at being really bad at handling problems. Maybe that's a better way to say it. And what I mean by that is this. What is your default response to crisis? Now, some of us, and you know who you are, some of us are the personality type that when a crisis arrives, before you even realize exactly what's happening, in the back of your mind, you're already making that list. Okay, I need this, 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 and this, and I'm going to handle it this way, and I'm going to say the water heater burst at home. You're already not thinking about, hey, we've got to call a plumber, but you're thinking about the aisle at Lowe's that the water heaters are on. You're already that far. You're ready to just jump into action and go. Some of you are that personality type. Some of you today are the personality type that you're like, oh, well, I don't even want to think about it. If I just close the door and kind of compartmentalize and put that off to the side, then eventually something's going to change. It's going to get a little better. And we just want to ignore or push it away. Some of you may be the personality type that when that arises and when that happens, you just fall completely apart and say, well, I just can't handle the stress of this. I don't know what your default is. I don't know what you immediately default to when troubles come up and problems arise. But today I want to challenge you with this first lesson that our default should be raising our concerns to the Lord. That it should be, when these situations arise, that we rely on Him. So look at what Hannah does. Picking up in verse 8. Hannah, why are you crying? Her husband Elkanah asked. Why won't you eat? Why is your heart so grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? So after they'd finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord in her bitter distress. And I want you to kind of note where that is there in verse 10. We're going to come back to it in a minute. In her bitter distress, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. And she made a vow, pleading, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look upon the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, not forgetting your maidservant, but giving her a son, then I will dedicate him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever come over his head. And Hannah kept on praying before the Lord. Eli watched her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and though her lips were moving, her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. And he said to her, how long will you be drunk? Put away your wine. No, my Lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have not had any wine or strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman, for all this time I have been praying out of the depth of my anguish and grief. Go in peace, Eli replied, and may the God of Israel grant you the petition you have asked of him. May your maidservant find favor with you, said Hannah. Then she went on her way, and she began eating again, and her face was no longer downcast. I want you to notice the contrast that takes place in the countenance of Hannah. The change that we see there once she has given this over to God. Interestingly enough, in verse 10, where I told you to take note and look at, the phrase there translated as bitter distress, or depending on your translation, it may say deeply distressed. That is the same word that last week when we talked about Naomi, the mother-in-law of Ruth, that Naomi, when she returned to her homeland, and they said, Naomi's back. Naomi said, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Same word, meaning distress, deeply distressed, how it's translated here. Or bitter distressed, means bitter. The ideal here being, though, that The situation that Hannah found herself in was so grave, was so depressing, was so overwhelming that Eli, when he sees her praying, assumes she is drunk. She says, no, and you saw the phrases there as I read them. I have poured out my soul, she said in verse 15. I have poured out my soul. I ask you today, when you find yourself in situations like this, are you like Hannah? Are you at the place that she finds herself in? Are you at the place where you say, I just can't carry this anymore? The burden is too great. It's too much. And you find yourself in bitter distress. Now, I will tell you that I was glad when I realized that this particular message was going to coincide with our Graduate Sunday. Because graduates, you will find yourself in the place that Hannah is at some point in your life. And what you do at that point speaks volumes about the relationship that you have with Christ. And so when we find ourselves in this place, how do we move from bitter distress in verse 10 to no longer downcast in verse 18? To not even being able to eat before verse 10 to by the time we get to verse 18, she is starting to eat again. Something changed. Well, the Psalms have many passages that reflect this attitude of change and the assurance that comes when we give things over to God, when we stop trying to carry that burden ourselves. And let me give you just a couple of them, okay? Psalm 46, verses 1 through 3 says this. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth is transformed and the mountains are toppled into the depths of the sea, though their waters roar and foam and mountains quake in the surge. Can you just hear the optimism in the voice of the psalmist there when they say, God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in times of trouble? What about Psalm 61, the first 4 verses? It says, hear my cry, O God, attend to my prayer. From the ends of the earth I call out to you whenever my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I am. For you have been my refuge, a tower of strength against the enemy. Let me dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. Again, the psalmist there pointing out that there is someone who can do something that I can't. You know what? The reality is sometimes the burden is going to be too great for you to carry. It is going to be too great for me to carry. But the reality is we don't have to carry it. The psalmist says, God is our refuge and strength. God will attend to our prayers. He will lead us to a rock higher than ourselves. He is our refuge. He is our tower of strength. It is in His tent that we take refuge. I hope you see the pattern there as we see it pointed out. And you say, well, but what about those times that I'm so overwhelmed I don't even know what to say. I don't even know what to do. Well, remember what Paul said in Romans 8 when he was talking about the Spirit, and he said this, in the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For when we do not know how we ought to pray, the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groans too deep for words. And He searches out our hearts. He who searches our hearts, rather, knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Christian, today I want you to just understand that when life hits you with those burdens, when it hits you with those trials, when it hits you with those difficulties, stop trying to handle it yourself. Stop trying to carry a load that we were never intended to carry by ourselves. And lift up your concerns to the Lord. Give it over to Him. That's the first lesson I think that we find from Hannah today. And the second one is this. Recognize that God is still working in your life and credit Him. Thankfully, as the account continues here, God wasn't finished with Hannah yet. And even though she may have thought He was, He wasn't. So 1 Samuel continues in verse 19 and 20 and says this. The next morning, Elkanah and Hannah got up early to bow and worship before the Lord and then returned home to Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked for him from the Lord. Hannah's bitter despair has been replaced with assurance that God has remembered her plea. Her barrenness was replaced with motherhood, and she acknowledges that his birth, Samuel's birth, is directly connected to her request to God. So we would do well to learn from that. Even in the midst of difficult times, we would do well to remember the example of Hannah and remember that no matter how difficult the time may be, God isn't finished with us yet. He's still at work. And because He's still at work, we need to acknowledge that to others. Again, let me turn back to the Psalms. I think they are full of excellent examples of this. Psalm 62, 1 and 2, it says, in God alone my soul finds rest. My salvation comes from Him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. And the psalmist closes this verse by saying, I will never be shaken. Psalm 118 says, let those who fear the Lord say, His loving devotion endures forever. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and He answered and set me free. And then listen to this series of questions and answers that the psalmist gives. He says, the Lord is on my side. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? The Lord is on my side. He is my helper. Therefore, I will look in triumph on those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. All the nations surround me, but in the name of the Lord I cut them off. They surround me on every side, but in the name of the Lord I cut them off. They swarmed like bees around me. They were extinguished like burning thorns. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. I was pushed so hard I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song, and He has become my salvation. What hope we find in those words. In the acknowledgement that no matter how bad it gets, verse 13 said, I was pushed so hard I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord helped me. Romans 8:28 reminds us, as it reminded the church there that Paul was writing to, that we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose. And we have to be very careful when we read that verse, because too many times we want to say, and we know that God works all things good for those who love Him. It's not what it says. Paul didn't write that. He didn't write that God is going to make sure that the only thing that ever happens in the life of those in Christ is good. He wrote, He will work all things together for the good. He doesn't say that bad times or difficulties or trials or distress are never going to be a part of your life, but He does promise you that God is still at work. He's not finished yet. And those who are called according to His purpose, God is going to take care of it and work through it. What a promise. It's why just a few verses later in Romans 8:31, after Paul has made that statement, he can say this. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And we need to remind ourselves of that. We need to remind ourselves of it. We need to remember that God isn't finished with us yet. He is still working through us. He is still working in us. He is still working on us. And one of the ways that I love to see this in action is just looking at some of the missions work that we support here in this congregation and reading the accounts of what some of our missionaries are working through and going through and enduring, but understanding that God is not finished with them yet. I recall the story about 20 years ago of one of our missionaries that I'm not going to name because of the persecution that they're facing right now, and this video is on YouTube. But if you're interested, see me after church, I can tell you exactly who it was and when it was. But he told the story that he was preaching in a town on the mission field that he's in where he had never preached before. And when he showed up to this rally, he said the local law enforcement official met him there at the location and said, "I don't agree with what you're about to say. And I want you to know that my officers are staged throughout the event. And they have been instructed that the first thing you say that could incite a riot, they are going to shoot you dead." Now, as this missionary spoke to a group of young people, he said, "I had a decision to make." But he said, for me, the decision had been made many, many years before. That Christ called me to this ministry, and he would not forsake me, so I will not forsake him. And he very straightforwardly proclaimed the gospel. And at the end, when he was finished, the same law enforcement official came to him and said, "I've never heard that before. I misunderstood what you were going to say and what you were going to be all about. So for the rest of the time that you are here in this region, my men will accompany you, and they will provide security for you." Now let that sink in. The same man whom he had instructed that you are to shoot him dead if anything comes out of his mouth that would be something we disagree with, are now providing security for him. You want to know why? Because God wasn't finished with him yet. And even in the midst of something overwhelming, God was still at work. God was still working through that. That was 20 plus years ago, and the ministry is still carrying forth today, even in the midst of persecution. So today, if you're facing that kind of difficulty, let me just remind you, God is still working. He is still active in your life, and be sure and tell others about it. That leads us to our last lesson from Hannah today. And that is that we need to return to the Lord what is His. And it really seems contradictory when you think about it. Hannah wanted a son for so long, and what does she do when she gets a son? She gives him away. And we look at that and we say, what is she doing? Well, let's read the passage and then we'll talk about it. It says, "Then Elkanah and all his house went up to make the annual sacrifice to the Lord." This is starting in verse 21. "But Hannah did not go. After the boy is weaned," she said to her husband, "I will take him to appear before the Lord and to stay there permanently." "Do what you think is best," her husband Elkanah replied, "and stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word." So Hannah stayed and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And once she had weaned him, Hannah took the boy along with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. Though the boy was still young, she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And when they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. "Please, my Lord," said Hannah, "as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this boy, and since the Lord granted me what I have asked of him, I now dedicate the boy to the Lord. For as long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord." And so they worshiped the Lord there. God heard the concerns that Hannah lifted up to him in her childlessness. He answered her prayers. He gave her a son. And Hannah recognized God's goodness and His blessing and His gift of a son to her. And so she keeps her promise and returns the boy to God as His servant for the rest of her life. It's a hard concept for us to grasp. Why is she so willing to give up that which she wanted so much? But you see, Hannah realized this principle. Samuel already belongs to God. God was the one who made him possible. God was the one who answered her prayers. God is the one who gave him to her. And so she is simply returning to God what He had blessed her with. And I think we need to remember in seasons and times of difficulty that we should be returning to God that which is His. He is worthy of our praise. He is worthy of our time. He is worthy of us returning the blessings that He has given to us back to Him. And I think we need to remember, like Paul told the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians, he said, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And then he talks about our giving, and he talks about how God loves us to be cheerful in our giving, and how God blesses and multiplies that which we give to him for his purpose and for his use. But I want you to remember this. Whatever we give God, our time, our abilities, of our possessions, of our wealth, where did it come from to begin with? Paul closes that section of 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 15 talking about that. And he says this, when we think about everything that God has given us, especially through the gospel of Christ, he says, thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. And in times of difficulty, it's sometimes hard for us to keep the perspective of returning to God what is his. But what better example do we find here in the example of Hannah, who wanted a child for so long that when God gave him her, she turns around and gives him back to God because of God's generosity to her. I want you to think about that passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 that I just read from about sowing sparingly and reaping sparingly. And let me ask you this. How generous are you sowing today? How generous are you with your time and what you return back to God? How generous are you with your abilities and what you're returning back to God? How generous are you with your relationships and what you return back to God? And yes, even how generous are you with the material blessings God showered upon us, and how are you returning that back to him? You see, we get so absorbed sometimes by situations that we face that we forget to return to God that which is already his. And when we do so, we find ourselves at odds with the proper perspective that we need to have. I want to read you just a short portion of President Abraham Lincoln's Thanksgiving Proclamation of 1863. Now, if you know much at all about history, you understand that those were difficult times in our nation. But listen to what he says. He says, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity, and we have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown." Then he goes on and says this, "But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." He goes on and says, "It has seemed to me fit and proper that God should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged with one heart and one voice by the whole American people." And that's just an excerpt from the middle of that, but doesn't it ring true even today? We have forgotten to return to God that which is his. So today, as the choir comes and we prepare for our song of decision today, let me just remind you of the lessons from Hannah. First, we raise our concerns to the Lord. Even in difficult times, we raise up to him the recognition that he alone is the one that can make the difference. He alone is the one that can do something about it. And in the distress of our heart and in the brokenness of what we feel and what we experience, we raise that before him. That's the first lesson. The second one is that we recognize that God is still working. He's not finished with us yet, and we give him credit for it. But the third one there, that we return to God that which is his. And so you see the question on the bottom of the screen this morning. Will you consider a relationship with Christ that enables you to face difficult times with a different perspective than those who are without hope. Because you see, to do those three things that Hannah did, we will only be able to do that through Christ and through a relationship with Him. And so today, if you're here and you're not in a relationship with Christ, we want to sit down with you and look through the Scriptures about what that looks like, what that means, so that you can apply these lessons from this mom named Hannah. And we love to walk with you through the pages of Scripture to help you understand things like belief and repentance and confession, what it means to be immersed, what it means to live a faithful life for Him. If you have a decision to make as we stand together today and sing, please come. Let's start that conversation.